is, wait, is it recording? I think it's recording now. Okay, hi. This is Drawn to Lodestone Rock, and I want you to read the first parts until on a steaming misty afternoon. Okay, so pause. Okay. On a steaming misty afternoon, Mr. Lorry sat at his desk and Charles Darnay stood leaning on it, talking with him in a low voice. The penitential den, once set apart for interviews with the House, was now the news exchange and was filled to overflowing. It was within half an hour or so before the time of closing, so Charles Darnay was in Tellson's. But although you are the youngest man that ever lived, said Charles Darnay, rather hesitating, I must still suggest to you. I understand that I am too old, said Mr. Lorry. Unsettled weather, a long journey, uncertain means of traveling, a disorganized country, a city that may not be be even safe for you. My dear Charles, said Mr. Lorry with cheerful confidence, you touch some of the reasons for my not going, for my going. Not, hold on, I'm a drink. Whew. For my staying away. It is safe enough for me. Nobody will care to interfere with an old fellow of hard upon fourscore when there are so many people there much better worth interfering with. As to its being a disorganized city, if it were not a disorganized city, there would be no occasion to send somebody from our house here to our house there, who knows the city and the business of old, and is in Tellson's confidence. As to the certain traveling, the long journey, and the winter weather, if I were not prepared to submit myself to a few inconveniences for the sake of Tellson's after all these years, who ought to be? So Charles Darnay is kind of saying, "Ay, Mr. Lorry, I don't think you should go to Paris, especially now. I know it's for business, but maybe you should reconsider." But Mr. Lorry was like, "I'll be fine." "I wish I were going myself," said Charles Darnay, somewhat restlessly, and like one thinking aloud. "Indeed, you are a pretty fellow to object and advise," exclaimed Mr. Lorry. "You wish you were going yourself? And you, a Frenchman born? You are a wise counsellor." "My dear Mr. Lorry, it is because I am a Frenchman born that the thought, which I did not mean to utter here, however, has passed through my mind often. One cannot help thinking, having some sympathy for the miserable people and having abandoned something to them." So Charles Darnay here is expressing some sort of guilt feeling. Murag, here I am in England, a Frenchman here in England, so happy, so at peace, while there are so many suffering in France right now. Like there's a revolution going on there. So somehow he felt a little bit murag na konsensya siya. He spoke here in his former thoughtful manner, that one might be listened to and might have the power to to persuade them to some restraint. Only last night, after you had left us, when I was talking to Lucy, when you were talking to Lucy, Mr. Lorry repeated. Yes, I wonder you are not ashamed to mention the name of Lucy, wishing you were going to France at this time of day. However, I am not going, said Charles Darnay with a smile. It is more to the purpose that you say you are. And I am, in plain reality. The truth is, my dear Charles, Mr. Lorry glanced at the distant house and lowered his voice. You can have no conception of the difficulty with which our business is transacted, and of the peril in which our books and papers over yonder are involved. The Lord above knows what the compromising consequences would be to a number of people if some of our documents were seized or destroyed. Remember in our lesson in French history when the revolution started, there were so many emigre uh, nobles who escaped France and actually lived in England. So here, Mr. Lorry is kind of saying that, can you imagine how our clients, mostly nobles, who are now in England here, can you imagine if their papers got destroyed? If their documents, if their titles and whatever got destroyed, it will be very, very bad for Telson. So here, kind of, we're given insider information on how the banking system worked during the French Revolution. Okay. And they might be at any time, for who can say that Paris is not set afire today or sacked tomorrow? Now, a judicious selection from these with the least possible delay and the burying of them, or otherwise getting of them out of harm's way, is within the power, without loss of precious time, of scarcely anyone but myself, if anyone. And shall I hang back when Telson knows this and says this, Telson whose bread I have eaten these 60 years? Because I am a little stiff about the joints. Why, I am a boy, sir. To a half dozen old codgers here. So tells Mr. Laurie he's already like 60, but he's still the youngest in Telson. So siya gyud ipada in business trips. My gosh. How I admire the gallantry of your youthful spirit, Mr. Laurie. Nonsense, sir. And my dear Charles, said Mr. Laurie, glancing at the house again, you are to remember that getting things out of Paris at this present time, no matter what things, is next to an impossibility. Papers and precious matters were this day brought to us here. I speak in strict confidence. It is not the business like to whisper even to you, but the strangest bearers you can imagine, every one of whom had his head hanging on by a single hair as he passed the barriers. At another time our parcels would come and go as easily as in business like old England, but now everything is stopped. And do you really need to go tonight? I really go tonight, for the case has been too pressing to admit of delay. And do you take no one with you? All sorts of people have been proposed to me, but I have nothing to say to any of them. I intend to take Jerry. Jerry has been my bodyguard on Sunday nights for a long time past, and I am used to him. Nobody will suspect Jerry of being anything but an English bulldog, or of having any designs in his head but to fly at anyone who touches his master. I must say again that I heartily admire your gallantry and youthfulness. I must say again, nonsense, nonsense. When I have executed this little commission, I shall perhaps accept Tellson's proposal to retire and live at my ease. Time enough then to think about growing old. Okay, so basta, this would be, this was the situation. Laurie had to go to Paris to secure documents and papers at the Tellson's branch in Paris. So I will you read all the way until the house approached Mr. Laurie. Okay, pause. Okay. The house approached Mr. Laurie and laying a soiled and unopened letter before him, as if he had yet discovered any traces of the person to whom it was addressed. The house laid the letter down so close to Darnay that he saw the direction the more quickly because it was his own right name. So while Darnay was at the bank, somebody went to Mr. Laurie's office and said, "Did you find already the recipient of this letter? I'm sure you already read that, no nga. Wa pag yun kakita asa ang recipient ani." And then when Darnay was kind of leading, he saw that it was his name. He was the recipient. The address turned into English ran, very pressing, to Monsieur there heretofore the Marquis Saint Evermond of France, confided to the cares of Messrs. Tellson and Co. Bankers, London, England. So Evermond. So kita siya shucks, it's mine, mangyud oy. On the marriage morning, Dr. Manette had made it his one urgent and express request to Charles Darnay that the secret of this name should be, unless he, the doctor, dissolved the obligation, keep inviolate between them. Nobody else knew it to be his name. His own wife had no suspicion of the fact. Mr. Laurie could have none. So only Dr. Manette knew that he was Evermond. "No," said Mr. Laurie in reply to the house, "I have referred it, I think, to everybody now here, and no one can tell me where this gentleman is to be found." The hands of the clock verging upon the hour of closing the bank, there was a general set of the current of talkers past Mr. Laurie's desk. He held the letter out inquiringly, and Monsignor looked at it in the person of his plotting and indignant refugee. The Monsignor looked at it in the person of that plotting and indignant refugee, and this, that, and the other all had something disparaging to say in French or in English concerning the Marquis who was not to be found. Darnay was the Marquis, raba, nephew, I believe, but in any case degenerate successor of the Polish Marquis who was murdered, said one, happy to say I never knew him. A craven who abandoned his post. Craven is coward. They said ayon, kakaward adto ang Marquis. Uy, he abandoned his post. A craven who abandoned his post, said another, this Monsignor, had been gone out of Paris, legs uppermost and half suffocated in a load of hay, some years ago. Infected with a new doctrine, said a third, eyeing the direction through his glass in passing, set himself in opposition to the last Marquis, abandoned the estates when he inherited them, and left them to the ruffian herd. They will recompense him now, I hope, as he deserves. Hey, cried the blatant striver, did he though? Is that the sort of fellow? Let's look at his infamous name, the fellow. Darnay, unable to restrain himself any longer, touched Mr. Stryver on the shoulder and said, "I know the fellow." "Do you, by Jupiter?" said Stryver. "I am sorry for it." "Why?" "Why, Mr. Darnay? Do you hear what he did? Don't ask why in these times." "But I do ask why." "Then I tell you again, Mr. Darnay, I am sorry for it. I am sorry to hear you putting any such extraordinary questions. Here is a fellow who, infected by the most pestilent and blasphemous scold of devilry that was ever known, abandoned his property to the vilest scum of the earth that ever did murder by wholesale, and you ask me why I am sorry that a man who instructs youth knows him? Well, but I'll answer you. I am sorry because I believe there is contamination in such a scoundrel. That's why." Mindful of the secret, Darnay with great difficulty checked himself and said, "You may not understand the gentleman." "I understand how to put you in a corner, Mr. Darnay," said bully Stryver, "and I'll do it. If this fellow is a gentleman, I don't understand him. You may tell him so with my compliments. You may tell him from me that, after abandoning his worldly goods and position to this butcherly mob, I wonder he is not at the head of them. But no, gentlemen," said Stryver, looking all around and snapping his fingers. "I know something of human nature, and I tell you that you'll never find a fellow like this fellow trusting himself to the mercies of such precious protégés. No, gentlemen, he'll always show him a clean pair of heels and very early in the scuffle and sneak away." With those words and a final snap of his fingers, Mr. Stryver shouldered himself into Fleet Street amidst the general approbation of his hearers. Mr. Lorry and Charles Darnay were left alone at the desk and the general departure from the bank. So Mr. Stryver kept judging, katong ni abandon nga Marquino, coward, he is not willing to face, and blah blah blah. And you know, Darnay, my gosh. "Will you take charge of the letter?" said Mr. Lorry. "You know where to deliver it?" "I do." "Will you undertake to explain that we suppose it to have been addressed here on the chance of our knowing where to forward it, and that it had been here some time?" "I will do so." "Do you start for Paris from here?" "Here at 8. I will come back to see you off." Very ill at ease with himself and with Stryver and most other men, Darnay made the best of his way into the quiet of the Temple, opened the letter and read it. These were the contents. Okay. Man, let me see, sabi. So these were the contents of the letter. June 21, 1792. Monsieur heretofore the Marquis. After having long been in danger of my life at the hands of the village, I have been seized with great violence and indignity and brought a long journey on foot to Paris. On the road I have suffered a great deal. Nor is that all. My house has been destroyed, razed to the ground. The crime for which I am imprisoned, Monsieur, heretofore the Marquis, and for which I shall be summoned before the tribunal and shall lose my life without your so generous help, is, they tell me, treason against the majesty of the people, in that I have acted against them for an immigrant. So Gabel, this servant, said nga, "I will go to trial because you are not here. There were charges brought against your family, and because the French side of your family is all dead and you are not here, and I am the caretaker, ako mooy gipriso, ako mooy gikiha, because I am the caretaker. Because you are not here, you are supposed to be in charge of this, but now my house has been destroyed. I am going to face trial, most likely death, because you are hiding, and I don't know where you are. It is in vain I represent that I have acted for them and not against, according to your commands. It is in vain I represent that, before the sequestration of emigrant property, I had remitted the impost they had ceased to pay, that I had collected no rent, that I had no recourse to no process. The only response is that I have acted for an emigrant, and where is that emigrant? Ah, most gracious Monsieur heretofore the Marquis, where is that emigrant? I cry in my sleep, where is he? I demand of heaven, will he not come to deliver me? No answer. Ah, Monsieur heretofore the Marquis, I sent my desolate cry across the sea. hoping it may perhaps reach your ears to the great bank of Tilson known at Paris. For the love of heaven, of justice, of generosity, of the honor of your noble man, I supplicate you, Monsieur, heretofore the Marquis, to succor and release me. My fault is that I have been true to you. My only fault is I was loyal to your house. And now I might die. O Monsieur, heretofore the Marquis, I pray you be true to me. From this prison here of horror, whence I every hour tend nearer and nearer to destruction, I send you, Monsieur, heretofore the Marquis, the assurance of my dolorous and unhappy service. Your afflicted Gabelle. Not Darnay. The latent uneasiness of Darnay's mind was roused to vigorous life by his letter. By this letter, the peril of an old servant and a good one, whose only crime was fidelity to him and his family, stared him so reproachfully in the face that as he walked to and fro in the temple considering what to do, he almost hid his face from the passer-by. He knew very well that in his horror of the deed which had culminated the bad deeds and bad reputation of the old family house, in his resentful suspicions of his uncle, and in the aversion with which his conscience regarded the crumbling fabric that he was supposed to uphold, he had acted imperfectly. He knew very well that in his love for Lucy, his renunciation of his social place, though by no means new to his own mind, had been hurried and incomplete. He knew that he ought to have systematically worked it out and supervised it, that he had meant to do it, and that it had never been done. Na guilty na si Darnay kay murag, oh my, I'm not taking responsibility. So, you read all the way to his resolution was made. Okay, pause. His resolution was made. He must go to Paris. Oh gosh. Yes, the lodestone rock was drawing him, and he must sail on until he struck. He knew of no rock, he saw hardly any danger, the intention of which he had done what he had done, even though he had left it incomplete, presented it before him in an aspect that would be gratefully acknowledged in France on his presenting himself to assert it. Then, that glorious vision of doing good, which is so often the sanguine mirage of so many good minds, arose before him, and he even saw himself in the illusion with some influence to guide this raging revolution that was running so fearfully wild. He walked to and fro with his resolution made. He considered that neither Lucy nor her father must know of it until he was gone. Lucy should be spared the pain of separation, and her father, always reluctant to turn his thoughts towards the dangerous grounds of old, which is Paris, should come to the knowledge of this step as a step taken, and not in the balance of suspense and doubt. How much of the incompleteness of his situation was referable to her father, through the painful anxiety to avoid reviving old associations of France in his mind. He did not discuss with himself, but that circumstance, too, had had its influence in his course. He walked to and fro with his thoughts very busy until it was time to return to Tellson's and take leave of Mr. Lorry. As soon as he arrived in Paris he would present himself to this old friend, but he must say nothing of his intention now. A carriage with post horses was ready at the bank door, and Jerry was booted and equipped. "I have delivered the letter," said Charles Darnay to Mr. Lorry. "I would not consent to your being charged with any written answer, but perhaps you will take a verbal one?" "That I will, and readily," said Mr. Lorry, "if it is not dangerous." "Not at all, though it is to a prisoner in the Abbaye." I keep thinking of the Abbaye as like a cliff, and then there's like a cage hanging, and then under it's just water. I don't know why. I know it's not, but that's always been what I have in my imagination. "What is his name?" Mr. Lorry, with his open pocketbook in his hand. "Gabelle." "Gabelle, and what is the message to the unfortunate Gabelle in prison?" "Simply that he has received a letter and will come." "Any time mentioned?" "He will start upon his journey tomorrow night." "Any person mentioned?" "No." He helped Mr. Lorry to wrap himself in a number of coats and cloaks, and went out with him from the warm atmosphere of the old bank into the misty air of Fleet Street. "My love to Lucy and to little Lucy." "I love little Lucy," said Mr. Lorry at parting, "and take precious care of them until I come back." Charles Darnay shook his head and doubtfully smiled as the carriage rolled away. Okay, now you read all the way until the unseen force. Okay, pause. The unseen force was drawing him fast to itself now, and all the tides and winds were setting straight and strong towards it. He left his 2 letters with a trusty porter to be delivered half an hour before midnight, and no sooner took horse for Dover and began his journey. He's going back. What na? Okay. For the love of heaven, of justice, of generosity, of the honor of your noble name, was the poor prisoner's cry, with which he strengthened his sinking heart, as he left all that was dear on earth behind him and floated away for the lodestone rock. Oh, it was hanging. Maybe I should read that again. I don't know if, because I think my, anyway. For the love of heaven, of justice, of generosity, of the honor of your noble name, was the poor prisoner's cry with which he strengthened his sinking heart, as he left all that was dear on earth behind him and floated away for the lodestone rock. The end of the second book. Ugh. Okay, my gosh. Book 3 is like action packed, like brace yourselves. It's very good. This is where everything comes together. All the building up of the characters, of the plot and everything. Book 3 just kind of like everything just collides. So Charles Darnay is going back to Paris during the French Revolution, and he has the blood and the name of a noble.